Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and I'm privileged to be joined by my mate, Garth Ennis. How are you doing, pal?
I'm pretty good, Andrew. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks, mate. Very well. Very much enjoyed the reading my PDF for the first issue of the book we're about to talk about. It's your new DC Black Label title, Batman Reptilian, which is a 6-issue series. Issue 1 has just come out, and you can order it from the links attached to this conversation. And if you're fast, you might still be able to order either the Cully Hamner variant cover or the Bill Sienkiewicz variant cover. But mate, what can you tell us about Reptilian, which it's got some amazing artwork by Liam Sharp as well?
Yeah, it really does. And it's great to be working with Liam after 30 plus years of knowing the guy, you know. Let's see, it all began about 6 years ago. Steve Dillon had been ill for a long time, but he was on the mend, he was on the way back, and he was starting to do some lovely work. And I thought the smart thing to do here is to do the most obvious and commercial thing possible to get him back up to where he should be. And I thought, given that the Preacher TV show was about to start and there was a lot of publicity, I thought, well, the Preacher team on Batman can't beat that. And that was where that came from. And I wrote the first 6 scripts, and the 6 scripts, and then fate intervened in the most catastrophic way imaginable. And that was that. And then the thing lay dormant for a while. And then Marie Javins, who had been the original editor, suggested Liam, because I think he was coming off a Green Lantern run with Grant.
With Grant Morrison, phenomenally popular run as well. Amazing.
Yeah, I hear that was good stuff. And it just seemed like one of those natural fits, you know. I mean, Liam would be available, we'd never worked together. And that is pretty much why that book came about. So again, another one with a long, twisted genesis, but it got there in the end.
Now, before we talk a bit more about Liam's art, so that genesis is fascinating, and of course, it must be when you're so identified with a great artist partner like you were with Steve. The loss of that when you've had one of those amazing partnerships, and you could always reunite and go back to. I imagine you guys, had he still been around, would have reunited and done more Punisher books whenever you felt like it. It's that kind of thing. That you must keenly feel that loss.
Very much so. I mean, we had all kinds of plans, all sorts of things we wanted to do. Certainly, you know, it would not have been a case of Batman and then that's it. I think as it turned out, the last thing Steve drew at my direction was the final cover of the Six Pack Meets Dog Welder series, where there's a little tinfoil, a little Blade Runner style tinfoil sculpture of Dog Welder. And given that Steve gave me the idea for Dog Welder in the first place, there is something oddly, touchingly appropriate about that. Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about him at length in the past, but one of the things I truly loved about him is he's a great example of somebody whose art style was almost 100% fully formed when he was 16. You know, if you see that Hulk comic, Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. strip that he did, that's 90% of his style is there, already kind of hard baked. And of course, he got better and improved as he got older, which everybody does. But nonetheless, his work's incredibly consistent from beginning to end in a way that almost no one's is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one thing I realized early on was how spoiled I was having such a good storyteller on my scripts. And I have occasionally directed younger, less experienced artists to Steve's work and said, you know, you in terms of storytelling, you really can't improve on that. And, you know, I know that there are people who've occasionally had a pop at Steve because he did make life easy on himself. He tended to reduce a lot of stuff to headshots and half headshots. But what they didn't realize was he was giving me exactly what I wanted and needed there. He was giving me the faces, and I do a lot of storytelling with characters, with little glances that people give with their reactions to, say, someone walking into a room, with someone in the background noticing something while a foreground character is talking. Steve was able to make all that work. And so he is a guy that I think all young comic artists should study, because if you can internalize what Steve did, I don't think you can go wrong in terms of storytelling.
I think that's a very well made point, and I think that the analogy that I'd strike is again something that we've talked about before, is his characterization is second to none. So he is able to portray, you know, the thoughts and intent of characters from the facial expressions alone in a way that just about no other artist is. And that thing about his artwork maybe being half cooked, it's like if you go and look at the classic film noir of the 40s and 50s. The sets are incredibly basic and they're very cheaply made, but it's all about, you know, the character's characterization and the art of the close-up performance that those actors are giving, you know, in a kind of sausage factory studio environment. That's what makes those films stand out, and that's to me, that's the analogy with Steve.
Yeah, you're quite right. It's the looks people are giving each other. It's the look someone has on their face that someone else crucially doesn't notice because they're too busy talking in the foreground. It's the way people react to one another. It's the reactions you see that you don't see. It's all absolutely crucial, and it's the way I like to tell stories in comics.
Yeah. And to bring it into the book as published, you are working with your mate Liam Sharp, who's made a radical departure from the work you just referenced on Green Lantern. That's him, but it is a kind of classic Apex. He's doing something very different with Batman Reptilian.
Yeah, he's going for something that at once is very dynamic and engaging and well, larger than life. Actually, there's a lot of big ideas, what Brett Ewins, I think, referred to as giant art in there. But it's also quite old-fashioned in a way. It harkens back to, well, really the period that Liam and I come from, the early 90s, when the names you heard on the kind of cutting edge of comic art were Bill Sienkiewicz, Simon Bisley, obviously, Dave McKean, and I think Liam has always channeled those guys, and also via Simon Bisley, probably Frank Frazetta and the like. So it's that full color painted, heavily textured work, very moody, very dark. A lot of characters emerging from shadows. Much more of that as it goes on, I can tell you. I think he's come up with something sort of simultaneously surreal and disturbing. I think he's made a complete world there. And again, as the story goes on and things get nastier, that'll just increase.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you've name checked everybody I was going to ask you about, and you can feel that on the page. But also, I can't think of another example of an artist at the peak of his powers and at the peak of his the accolades he's received, fresh off like this red hot run on a book that a lot of people love and care about, for them to then go and do something so experimental just without missing a beat that's equally proficient and isn't a fucking disaster. It's amazing. You know, that's all props to him for actually taking that risk, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting because the way Liam has talked about it, he said that knowing that Steve would have drawn the book, he didn't take Steve's art as his lead. Instead, he thought in terms of what Steve himself would say to him, Liam, and that was, you do it your way, mate. You go down the road you want to do. That was what Steve always encouraged people to do, was to do it their own way, to find what it was they wanted to do and then stick to that and explore that. And that's exactly what Liam's done on this.
Yeah, it is great stuff. And to end where you would normally start on a conversation like this, what can you tell me about the premise of the book?
Okay. Well, what's happened is that Batman is finding that his rogues gallery are being steadily knocked off 1 and 2 at a time. something's working its way through the Gotham underworld and leaving carnage in its wake. And now only issue 1 is out so far. And this is a bit of the first couple of issues are kind of a slow burn, but he's going to find out that something's happening big changes are happening to one of his villains in particular, with very unpleasant results for that character, but even more, potentially more catastrophic results for Gotham. And of course, he's going to have to spend a couple of issues watching terrible things happen to the Riddler and the Penguin and the others and the Joker. I actually enjoyed carving up the Joker quite a bit because I think he's the most annoying character in the comic. Being around that guy would be just excruciating.
Yeah.
But eventually he will narrow it down to, I was going to say the villain of the piece, but really in a lot of ways the victim of the piece, because what happens to this guy won't be nice at all. Watch this space.
Right, amazing, mate. And you've touched upon what I was going to ask you. Given that, you know, you're a notorious superhero, supervillain, super universe skeptic, is there a joy to be had inflicting pain on this extremely famous, you know, kind of rogues gallery of extreme characters?
That was good fun. The reason I can't take any of those characters seriously is I just don't see them as being a match for Batman. I mean, here he is. He's 6'6", built like a brick shithouse, incredibly smart, massive resources, drives around in pretty much a tank. And all these cackling, giggling, multicolored buffoons are going to have a pop at that. I just don't see it happening. And so going through them with a buzzsaw, yes, I had a good laugh doing that. As for Batman himself, I mean, I have the same sort of skepticism about him as any other superhero character. What makes him a little different, I think because he's just a bloke and he's decided to dress up as a bat and he doesn't have any particular powers, there's something absurd about Batman that you don't get from most other superhero characters. They're multicolored, superpowered, incredibly strong, able to fly, teleport, mind read, turn invisible. They can do all these things, and it all comes down to fantasy, outright fantasy that has nothing to do with anything. Whereas I did think that conceivably a guy could get himself into Batman's shape and he could put on that suit. And if he had the money for it, he could trick out a car and make himself a kind of Batmobile. And you could potentially run into someone like that walking down the street. And to me, that's just so wonderfully absurd and ridiculous. The thought of someone like that just bopping down the street. And I think that was my way into the character. You know, there he is. It's Batman. Batman on the street, Batman getting out of his car, Batman going to the cash machine, Batman getting a cup of coffee, things like that. I think that was what made him that bit easier to write than one of the other superhero characters, which, as I say, is just fantasy. And I can't really find any way into.
No, well said. I think that's very interesting. And of course, it would take a very different take on a character. One of the brilliant things about the Adam West Batman show is Batman's interaction with the day-to-day and the mundane. He does shit in that show that never does in the comics, whether it's running up the steps of, you know, City Hall in daylight, or, you know, putting a seatbelt on, or stopping for a cup of coffee or a snack or whatever. The fact that really treble underlines the absurdity of it when you have him just walking around doing that stuff.
Exactly. I mean, obviously, he doesn't really work in broad daylight, and that's why he spends so much time on rooftops lurking in the shadows, but he can't lurk all the time. Eventually he's got to come down off the rooftop, step out of the alleyway, lose that kind of natural camouflage that he relies on, and that's when it gets funny for me. That's when it gets almost engaging. I mean, I like that old Adam West show. I have to say a little of it goes a long way, but I think it was knowing that show that partly helped me enjoy The Dark Knight the first time I read it, because seeing these characters that I thought of as really just silly, suddenly treated with such absolute seriousness, and such absolute conviction. It's one of the many strengths of Dark Knight. Talking about the first one here, it carries you through that book. I think that sheer commitment in a way that perhaps might not otherwise have worked. That was actually that was not only the first Batman comic I read cover to cover, it was the first American superhero comic I read cover to cover. So you can imagine how I might have gotten the wrong end of the stick.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I pretty soon discovered that it was the exception that proved the rule.
Right.
Really.
What an amazing thing to immerse yourself in as your first experience.
Yeah. I remember immediately after that, thinking, what a fool I've been, throwing my life away on other comics. I must go out and get as many DC and Marvel comics. I did.
Was that your like most disappointing month at the comic shop ever?
Yeah. Well, it was in those days, of course, no comic shops in Northern Ireland. It was just a question of going to the local newsagent and picking up what they had and distribute. I've talked about this before. The distribution of that stuff was so spotty. It was just a matter of getting what had trickled through. So it wasn't exactly consistent, but yeah, I mean, there was a pretty big drop off in quality, I can tell you.
I hear you, brother. This puts me in mind of kind of one final thing, which is a lot of great Batman art, Batman vistas by incredible artists, often involve these amazing poses of Batman in the small of the night, at the top of a skyscraper, standing out on a gargoyle looking over the city, right? What I always think when I look at that is, that's a fucking ridiculous thing to do. Why would you scale that building and then walk out on this very precarious dead drop to have a think? You know, surely you just wouldn't. Who would do that? You know what I mean? What human being would do that? It looks great, but the reality of it, the physics of it, makes no sense.
Yes, it's one of those things no one sensible would do, and that adds to that sort of enjoyable absurdity of the character, I think.
Yeah, well, it's to come back to your take on the enjoyable absurdity of Batman, which is a very dark, deep dive into that absurdity. It's Batman Reptilian. The first issue is out now. There's some great variant covers by Bill Sienkiewicz and Cully Hamner, which are still available if you hit up the links attached to this conversation. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens across the next 5 issues, mate.
All right.
Take care, man. All the best.
All right. Cheers, Andrew.
Bye-bye. If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.